On Sunday, May 19, 1996, 27-year-old Lori Winfield and 25-year-old Jenna Wallace set out on a hiking trip in Blue Ridge National Park. Accompanied by Jenna's loyal golden retriever, Max. Jenna was originally from St. Paul, Minnesota, while Lori had grown up in Fairfield, Vermont. Despite their different backgrounds, both had a deep love for nature and outdoor adventures. The two had first met nearly 2 years earlier while working at a now-closed nonprofit in Minnesota called Wild Women, an organization that taught wilderness survival skills and funded outdoor excursions for women. Friends described Lori Winfield as a beer-drinking, music-loving, free-spirited woman who enjoyed a good time. She came from an affluent Michigan family but left home after finishing high school to enroll at Greenfield College near Burlington, Vermont, where she pursued studies to become a wilderness guide. It seemed Lori's love for nature ran so deep that she dedicated herself to helping others find solace in the wild, just as she had. Jenna Wallace, meanwhile, was not only a skilled geologist but also a remarkable athlete. In high school, she had won the Minnesota State Doubles Tennis Championship before traveling to Spain to research the extinction of the dinosaurs. After graduating with top honors, Jenna secured a job at a bookstore near Lake Champlain, Vermont. The hiking trip was meant as a final adventure before she started her new job on June 1, 1996. However, when Jenna failed to arrive for her first shift, concerns quickly grew. On May 31, 1996, after more than a week without contact, Jenna's father, Thomas Wallace, reported her missing. A large-scale search effort was launched, culminating in the discovery of Lori and Jenna's car parked near High Ridge Lodge. Bridget Monroe, the deputy chief ranger of Blue Ridge National Park, later stated, "We began urgent searches along the trail corridors in that general area to try and locate them. During one of these searches, they found Max, Jenna's golden retriever, wandering the park without a leash." The following evening, on June 1, 1996, park rangers came across the remains of Jenna and Lori at their campsite near a bridle path. The women had been bound and gagged before their throats were slashed. Investigators later recovered their camera, which provided a glimpse into their final days. They had ventured along the White River Trail before catching a ride from a park ranger after unexpected bad weather. Once the skies cleared, they hiked to Eagles Peak, the tallest mountain in the park, before choosing a scenic camping spot by a stream. Based on evidence, detectives determined that just hours after their last pictures were taken, their lives had been brutally stolen. Even more disturbing was how close their campsite was to well-traveled areas. Just a quarter mile from Ridgeview Road and half a mile from High Ridge Lodge, a popular area filled with tourists, hikers, and visitors enjoying Memorial Day weekend. Someone must have witnessed something, but finding the right person to speak up was another challenge. It seemed inconceivable that two people could be killed so close to a bustling park area without anyone noticing. However, backcountry camping rules at the time required campers to stay away from marked trails, roads, and developed sites, which ultimately played into the hands of their killer. Jenna and Lori were far from the only people to vanish under mysterious circumstances in national parks. While many disappear due to accidental falls, getting lost, or encounters with wildlife, homicides in these remote areas carry a uniquely chilling quality. This sentiment was echoed by Sally Herbert, the park's management specialist. "We don't see much crime in the park," she said, "but when we found those poor women, it was terrifying. The idea that someone capable of such horror had been here with us was deeply unsettling." The FBI assigned specialized units to assist the National Park Service in investigating the case, working alongside the Virginia State Police's Crime Scene Unit, which brought in forensic specialists. However, despite their combined efforts, solving crimes in national parks presents unique challenges. One FBI agent explained, "The sheer number of people coming and going makes it easy for someone to escape unnoticed." In 1996 alone, 1.57 million people visited the park. It's a transient environment, which makes tracking a suspect extremely difficult. Another agent noted that crime scenes in outdoor locations are significantly larger than those in enclosed spaces. You're not just dealing with one area. The entire surrounding region is a potential crime scene. The path the perpetrator took, their point of entry and exit, It all expands the investigation zone and makes evidence harder to collect. For over a year, law enforcement followed thousands of leads, but the case seemed to grow cold. Then, in July 1997, another violent incident shattered the park's peace. Blue Ridge Drive was a favorite route for cyclists, and on that summer day, Canadian tourist Yvonne LaBerge was pedaling along the scenic road when a man in a large truck suddenly forced her off the path. Yvonne later recalled how the driver hurled profanities at her before attempting to pull her into his vehicle. She managed to escape by hiding behind a tree, but instead of leaving, the attacker tried to run her over. The horrifying chase only ended when he crashed his truck into a tree and fled. Fortunately, park rangers arrested him before he could exit the park. His name was Darren Rice. During a search of Darren's vehicle, authorities found zip ties in his glove compartment, likely intended for restraining victims. Darren, a Maryland resident in his late 20s, had no prior criminal record but had been fired from his job at a tech company for erratic behavior. Former co-workers recalled his volatile temper, his tendency to lash out, and an incident where he punched a hole in a bathroom wall after being confronted for stealing food from the break room. In 1998, Darren pleaded guilty to attempted abduction and received an 11-year prison sentence. Investigators soon suspected he might be connected to Lori and Jenna's murder. Evidence pointed to his presence in the park around the time of their deaths. Security footage captured him entering the park on May 25, 1996, and leaving at Rockwell Pass the following day, coinciding with the couple's timeline. Moreover, he returned on June 1st, possibly to dispose of evidence, only to find a heavy police presence, which may have deterred him. When questioned, Darren denied visiting the park in May, though he admitted he was there on June 1st with friends. This statement directly contradicted surveillance footage, proving he had lied. Despite these suspicions, the case against Darren wasn't strong enough. Prosecutors spent years compiling evidence, and in 2001, he was indicted for 4 counts of capital murder, 2 of which were classified as hate crimes. If convicted, he could have faced the death penalty. Prosecutors claimed he had boasted about targeting women because, in his words, they were easier to overpower. Worse still, he allegedly admitted to the murders, insisting the victims deserved it because of their relationship. But in 2003, the case collapsed when forensic testing on a single hair from the crime scene proved it did not belong to Darren. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the charges were dropped. Today, the FBI remains tight-lipped about potential suspects, and Lori and Jenna's murder remains an open investigation. In 2016, on the 20th anniversary of their deaths, the FBI issued new press releases and updated missing persons posters. Agent Robert Kowalski stated, "We hope continued attention on this case will lead someone to come forward with crucial information. The families deserve justice. Had they lived, Lori and Jenna would now be in their 50s, likely still enjoying their passion for the great outdoors. Though years have passed, their loved ones, and the old park rangers who remember that tragic case, still honor their memory." One former ranger reflected, "When I learned they were geologists, it hit me hard. I'm an amateur geologist myself, and I thought about how they were just out there having fun, exploring, and then something so terrible happened. It changed the way I approached my job. I never looked at my duties the same way again." More than 2 decades have gone by since that fateful day in Blue Ridge National Park. While the park remains a haven for nature lovers, the memory of what happened lingers. Next time you find yourself atop Eagles Peak or gazing at the stars in Meadow Valley, spare a thought for Lori and Jenna, 2 souls who set out on an adventure, only to cross paths with unimaginable evil. Back in August of 2014, I was doing a bit of solo backpacking around the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon. I made several stops in different areas of the national forest, and a few days into my trip, I ended up in a small town called Millridge. While wandering around, I found myself on a random dirt road that dead-ended at a breathtaking spot along the Clackamas River. It was absolutely stunning. There was this old wooden footbridge stretching across the water, something straight out of a fantasy novel. And with it being August, the heat was nearly unbearable. There I was, completely alone, staring at this crisp, cool river, the water looking so refreshing. By that point, I probably hadn't properly bathed in 4 or 5 days, so I wasn't exactly feeling clean. You can probably guess what happened next. I pulled my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, turned it around just in case I needed to make a quick escape, then grabbed a towel and hiked down the slope to the riverbank. I didn't have a swimsuit with me, but I figured stripping down to my underwear would be good enough for a quick wash without feeling too exposed. Now, as deep in the wilderness as I was, it seemed like I was completely alone. Heavy emphasis on seemed, because as I would soon find out, I wasn't. You know that weird sense people talk about, like when you just know you're being watched? It sounds like a cliche, right? Like something that depends on how paranoid someone is. Well, I'm not paranoid in the slightest. In fact, I'd say I'm the kind of person who isn't bothered by stuff that makes others uneasy. Some people won't even go camping without a fully functional bathroom nearby, hence why I was out here alone. I didn't feel watched exactly, more like a sudden realization that what I was doing was just a bad idea. I couldn't put my finger on why at first. It's not like sharks swim up the Clackamas, but something just felt off. I tried shaking it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. But no matter how hard I tried, that feeling wouldn't go away. So after a few minutes of scrubbing, I climbed out of the water and walked back toward where I had left my towel and clothes. As I was heading up the bank, I had my back to the other side of the river, and reaching my towel felt like hitting some kind of home base. That creeping feeling was starting to fade until I happened to glance across the river. First, I thought I was looking at a bear, but within seconds, I realized a bear would have been far less of a problem. Standing on the opposite riverbank, a little higher up than me, was a man. Every piece of clothing he had on looked like it was handmade from animal hides. His hair was wild, looking almost like dreadlocks, except some sections seemed to be twisted around sticks. He looked like someone who had been living out in the wilderness for years, completely off the grid. My skin crawled when I later saw my boyfriend playing some cowboy video game and crafting clothes from animal skins, because one of the outfits looked almost exactly like what I had seen that day. Only this wasn't some game. This was real. And this man wasn't just some harmless drifter. We locked eyes for a moment, both startled by each other's presence. Then, without a word, he bolted toward the footbridge. The second I saw him move, my stomach twisted. I prayed that the worst that would happen was him yelling at me to put some clothes on, maybe some harmless backwoods eccentric who wasn't happy about me trespassing. But the fact that he didn't say anything, he just started closing the distance, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't coming over for a friendly chat. I sprang into action, grabbing my keys, shoes, and clothes, but my clothes got tangled in some thick brambles. In that split second, I made the decision to leave them behind. My survival was worth more than a shirt and some pants. I tore through the bushes, feeling the thorns rip into my skin. When I finally broke free, I could see him already halfway across the bridge, moving fast. I sprinted to my car, yanked the door open, and barely managed to slam it shut and lock it just as he reached me. The second I hit the locks, he slammed his fists against the hood, screaming. No words, just these guttural, animalistic sounds. He pounded on the driver's side door, trying to wrench it open. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the gas, tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. Even as I tore down that dirt road, I could see him in the rearview mirror, chasing me. He ran after my car for nearly a mile before finally disappearing from view. By the time I stopped, I was a wreck, bleeding from the scratches, soaking wet, barefoot, shaking, and crying. And the terrifying part? If I had hesitated for just a few seconds longer, I don't think I'd be alive to tell this story. Even typing this out all these years later, I feel my hands shaking. It was the first time in my life that I truly felt hunted. That's the only way I can describe it. I've never gone back to that place, and I never will. Since then, I always take someone with me whenever I go hiking. That day will haunt me for the rest of my life. I've spent years in therapy, and even now, the memory is as clear as the day it happened. My name is Tom, and I'm a member of a walking group based in Scotland called the Pathfinder Society. We're an organization dedicated to enjoying hiking and trekking while also preserving the beautiful landscapes that people cherish. I get it, on the surface it might sound dull. And I won't lie, most of our members are either retirees in waterproof jackets or survivalist types who think they're in some kind of adventure documentary. But weekend walks weren't what drew me to the Pathfinders in the first place. When you look into their past, you realize that they actually had quite a radical beginning. To keep things brief, the whole hiking rights movement really took off in the late 1800s. Wealthy landowners wanted to claim vast sections of the countryside for themselves, shutting the public out completely. Naturally, this sparked protests, leading to mass trespassing events where people deliberately walked onto private land to challenge the restrictions. There were clashes, arrests, and even injuries. The movement eventually led to laws being passed that protected public access rights to these natural areas. So when you go on a hike, you're not just taking in the scenery, you're exercising a hard-won right to be there. And to me, that's something worth celebrating. Sorry for the little history lesson, but I usually tell people this to give them a bit of a rebellious reason to join. After all, we do want to encourage new members. But trust me, there are things I don't tell them. Things that might make them think twice about ever setting foot in the wild again. Because if you spend enough time wandering through forests, hills, and remote landscapes, you're bound to encounter things that don't quite add up, and some that outright frighten you. Since I've already talked your ear off about hiking history, I guess it's only fair that I share a strange experience of my own. This happened while I was trekking near a town called Keswick in northern England. I was hiking through some dense woodland near an area called Greystone Forest when I stumbled upon what I thought was just an ordinary clearing. I hadn't planned on stopping. It was drizzling, and the trees offered good cover. But something caught my eye. It looked like a bundle of grass floating in midair. It reminded me of one of those strange visual effects from an old art house film. I stood there for a moment, watching it gently sway in the wind. Of course, when I got closer, I realized it wasn't floating. It was hanging from a tree branch high above. Someone had carefully fashioned a ball entirely out of turf. Being naturally curious, I decided to take a closer look. At a distance, it just seemed like clumps of grass, but as I inspected it, I saw it was solid, like a perfect sphere of earth, as if someone had cut out a chunk of a lawn and rolled it into a ball. When I searched for seams or ties holding it together, I couldn't find any. It looked almost like a miniature world suspended in the air. The twine securing it to the tree looked handmade, woven from plant fibers. It must have taken serious skill to craft something that sturdy. And the branch it hung from? That belonged to a towering oak tree, at least 20 feet up. Whoever put it there had either used a ladder or was an incredible climber. But what really unsettled me was what lay directly beneath the hanging turf ball. First, it seemed like just an old tree stump, but as I examined it, I noticed it had been worn down nearly to ground level, leaving behind only a ring of bark. Inside this ring was an intricate arrangement of twigs, reeds, and woven wildflowers, arranged in concentric circles, like the petals of a blooming rose. There must have been hundreds of twigs, some bent into curves to create a mesmerizing, almost three-dimensional pattern. It was breathtaking and eerie. As I leaned in to inspect the arrangement, I noticed that not all of the pieces were twigs. One particular object caught my attention. I picked it up, thinking it was just a bit of wood. But the second I held it, I realized it was bone. At first, I assumed it was from an animal, maybe a small deer or rabbit. But then, a chilling thought hit me. It could just as easily be a human finger or toe. My stomach turned, and I dropped the bone immediately. But for some reason, I couldn't leave it out of place. As if compelled by some unspoken rule, I carefully placed it back exactly where I found it. My first instinct was to take a picture. People needed to see this. But just as I reached for my phone, I heard something, movement in the trees behind me. My heart jumped. I turned around, half expecting to see the person responsible for this bizarre creation. But there was no one. I told myself it could be a deer or a fox. There's plenty of wildlife in the area. But I didn't hear anything running away, just an eerie silence. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled. I called out, hoping whoever was out there would reveal themselves. Maybe they were just as startled as I was. But there was no reply, just that deafening silence. A wave of unease washed over me. I felt instinctively that turning my back might be a mistake. What if the person out there wasn't just an artist, but someone dangerous? After all, if they were willing to use bones in their work, who's to say what else they'd be willing to do? I put my phone away and slowly backed out of the clearing, keeping my eyes on the trees. Then, as soon as I felt I was at a safe distance, I turned and walked, fast until I was far away. Safe from what exactly? I didn't know, but as I put distance between myself and that strange place, I found myself questioning everything I had just seen. I wanted to go back. I really did, but something inside me screamed not to. I did return eventually, weeks later, when I finally worked up the nerve. By then, everything was gone. The turf ball had been cut down. The intricate pattern in the tree stump had been removed. It was as if it had never been there at all. That should have been reassuring. But somehow the absence made it worse. Had someone else stumbled upon it and destroyed it? Or had I, simply by discovering it, triggered its removal? And if so, what had I interrupted? I searched for any remains, especially the small bones, but found nothing. Then, just like before, I backed away and continued my hike. To this day, that remains the single most unsettling thing I've ever encountered while out walking. It was beautiful in a way, but when I think about the bones, the silent observer in the trees, and the feeling of being unwelcome, I can't help but be glad it's gone. I studied zoology in university, and one semester, a guest speaker was invited to give us a lecture. We instantly recognized her name since she was a well-known figure in the world of orangutan conservation research. After her talk, we learned that she was looking for 2 students to assist with a year-long research project after graduation. The fieldwork was being conducted in Sumatra. I had always wanted to travel but had no idea how I would ever afford it. So having everything covered by the research grant felt like an unbelievable opportunity. For someone who grew up in a quiet town in Ohio, nothing seemed more exotic than Sumatra, located in Southeast Asia, just west of Malaysia. The entire journey felt like a dream come true. But I cannot emphasize this enough. It was incredibly tough work. We had to wake up around 3:30 a.m., work 6 days in a row, then take 3 days off. Our shifts lasted roughly 14 to 15 hours in the sweltering, humid jungle, tracking wild orangutans while documenting their behaviors every couple of minutes. These were completely wild orangutans, and we did everything possible to maintain a safe distance, never attempting to touch them. The goal was to observe without interfering with their natural habits. That being said, during my year there, I was charged 3 different times by one of the large dominant males in the area. Each time was absolutely terrifying, but that's a story for another day. He never actually reached me, but he scared me so badly that I ran every single time. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, and the swarms of mosquitoes made it nearly unbearable at times. On top of that, we had virtually no contact with the outside world. The only way to communicate was on our days off, when we had to walk nearly an hour to a specific tree in the jungle. The signal wasn't strong enough for actual phone calls, but sometimes we could get just 1 bar of service, enough to send a handful of WhatsApp messages to friends and family. You would type everything up in advance, then wait for that brief window of service so the messages could send. After that, it was back on airplane mode to save battery, and then the next person would take their turn. One morning, during a regular shift, we woke up, went through our usual morning routine, and then set off into the jungle at sunrise. I was beyond exhausted, struggling to keep my eyes open, but in a split second, I went from barely awake to completely alert. Just a few meters ahead, crouched among the vegetation off the trail, was a clouded leopard. It remained perfectly still, staring at us with its large golden eyes while the other American researcher and I froze. Encounters like this are almost unheard of, not just because these animals are rare, but because they usually avoid areas where humans are active. I assumed it would bolt in the opposite direction once it noticed us, and I remember telling myself, enjoy this moment while it lasts. But when the leopard slowly lifted itself onto its legs and took a few silent steps in our direction, fear kicked in. Luckily, one of the local trackers we worked with pulled out his slingshot and fired a small stone at the ground near it. That was all it took. The moment the rock landed, the leopard darted back into the dense jungle. It took us several minutes to calm down, and our guide explained that it was likely a young leopard, still learning about its surroundings. It had probably been watching us the night before and had followed us at sunrise, only for us to stumble upon it unexpectedly, sending it into a fight or flight mode. If it weren't for our guide, we could have been in serious danger. One of us might have even owed him our life. Once we felt ready, we continued down the trail. As I mentioned earlier, it was still very early, and the thick jungle canopy blocked out most of the sunlight. Even though there was enough light to see, plenty of areas were still cloaked in deep shadow, which made me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and started shining it into the darker sections of the jungle. The first spot, nothing. The second spot, nothing. But in the third boom, a pair of glowing eyes stared right back at me. My flashlight wasn't strong enough to fully illuminate the animal, but there was no mistaking it. The leopard was still there, hidden in the shadows, watching us. And this is why we worked such long, exhausting hours and remained out in the jungle for such extended periods. Jungle research is dangerous, sometimes in ways you wouldn't expect. Predators like big cats are only part of the risks we faced. We knew we couldn't just continue hiking with a leopard stalking us. Technically, since they are ambush predators, as long as we kept our eyes on it, we should have been safe. But try keeping constant watch on an animal that has evolved for millions of years to remain unseen. One moment of distraction, one small mistake, and one of us could have been seriously hurt or worse. No scientific discovery is worth someone's life. So, yeah, getting stalked by a clouded leopard was hands down the most terrifying thing that happened to me during my year in Sumatra. I'm a water scientist, which pretty much just means I spent most of my 20s studying water without losing my mind from boredom. Kidding aside, it's actually way more fascinating than you'd expect. If you get a solid degree from a reputable school, your career options are pretty wide. We work with farmers to make sure crops get enough water, with purification plants to ensure clean drinking water, and with utility companies to guarantee it reaches homes safely and in abundance. We also conduct surveys on rivers that might be dammed for energy production. If done right, a dam can be a great source of renewable power without destroying too much of the surrounding ecosystem. It was one of these surveys that took me deep into the wilderness of northern Montana in the summer of 2019. Given the season, it seemed like a dream gig. Officially, it was a high-stakes, well-paid job that could make or break someone's multi-million-dollar government contract. But between you and me, it felt like a paid hiking trip. I just had to navigate the terrain, check out the rock formations, jot down some notes. I figured I could stretch the job to 5 or 6 days, taking my time enjoying the sunshine and the paycheck. I barely lasted 3. By the third night, I was sprinting out of those woods with only my car keys, my phone, and a survival knife. There's something in the forest up there, something bad. My first day started in a little town called Red Hollow, a quiet place with a general store where I grabbed some last-minute supplies. When I asked the clerk about a safe place to leave my car, he kindly let me park behind the shop and promised to keep an eye on it while I hiked. The pine forests? I was ready for those. The steep hills? Not so much. I consider myself pretty fit, but those inclines were brutal. Even zigzagging to reduce the strain, hauling my gear up to my first campsite was pure torture. I crashed hard that night, barely finishing my work before exhaustion knocked me out. The next morning was more of the same. Aching muscles, sweat-drenched clothes, but I kept a positive mindset, telling myself I was getting one heck of a workout. I had never smelled so awful in my life, and the idea of hiking down to the river for a rinse, only to sweat all over again on the way back, felt like some twisted joke. I settled for baby wipes that night, promising myself I'd wash properly the next day when I refilled my water supply. On the third morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. I popped some painkillers, pulled on my boots, and walked into the trees to relieve myself. only to notice my urine was the color of whiskey. I had underestimated how much water I needed and was seriously dehydrated. I immediately set off for the river, desperate to drink as much fresh water as I could and get myself clean. Once I arrived, I gulped down water like my life depended on it, then stripped down to my underwear and waded into the shallows. As I was getting out, I thought I saw something shift near my pile of clothes. Unless a freak gust of wind had passed through, something was moving in the trees. I felt uneasy, but it was probably just a deer, so I grabbed my things and hiked back to camp. Later that afternoon, I was out hiking when I caught a foul stench, so strong it made me gag. At first, I thought it was me. Maybe my clothes reeked worse than I realized. But the farther I walked, the worse the smell got, until I was fighting the urge to vomit. Then, just as I looked up for some fresh air, I saw it, a fox or maybe a coyote, but in such a horrifying state that I couldn't tell which. It looked like someone had caught it, beaten it to death, then strung it up in a tree. The only reason I could think of for doing something like that was to scare off other predators, like a warning. It was cruel but effective, I guess. Except, there weren't any farms nearby. Then I realized that wasn't the only dead thing hanging from the trees. I kept walking, trying to escape the stench. The summer heat only made it worse. But no matter which way I went, I couldn't shake the smell, and that's when I understood why. The dead were everywhere. Every few trees, something was hanging in various stages of decay. Raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, even a half-rotted deer carcass. At least I hoped it was just a deer. That was it. I was done. Like I mentioned earlier, I turned and ran. I didn't pack my tent, didn't gather my gear, just grabbed what I could and bolted. I made it back to my car in Red Hollow and got the hell out of there. I don't even want to think about how much money I lost by abandoning that job. If I tried to calculate it, I think I'd be sick. But at the same time, I can't imagine any amount of money that would make me go back. Not if it meant ending up like those animals hanging in the trees. Back when I was in college, I spent my summers working at a boys' outdoor camp. This particular story took place the summer after I graduated, making it the last time I ever worked there. Each week, I was responsible for leading a large group of campers to a spot in the woods that seemed pretty isolated, though, truth be told, it wasn't that far from the main campgrounds. The purpose of these trips was to help the kids earn their wilderness survival badge, which meant learning skills like building shelters out of branches and leaves to sleep in, starting campfires, and cooking meals over an open flame. Like I said, we weren't exactly lost in the middle of the mountains, just about a half-mile from camp. But we'd walk the kids around in circles for a bit to make it feel more remote. One particular night, the campers had finished constructing their shelters. We'd cooked dinner, and we were all gathered around the fire, singing songs and sharing spooky stories. It was getting late. Well, late for kids, around 10 p.m., so I sent them off to their makeshift shelters for the night and began putting out the fire as part of our usual safety routine. That's when we heard it, the faint tolling of a church bell somewhere in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that both the campers and I could make it out. The bell rang at intervals of about 10 seconds, lasting for only a couple of minutes. Since we had just finished telling eerie campfire stories, the kids were already on edge, whispering among themselves about ghosts and other supernatural things. I did my best to reassure them, saying it was probably just a church service from a nearby town, but in the back of my mind, I was unsettled. As far as I knew, there wasn't a town or even a church anywhere within 20 miles of us. I later checked a map and confirmed that fact. Curious, I asked one of the senior camp counselors if there were any old churches in the area that might have bells ringing at night. He immediately gave me a look that made me feel uneasy. After a pause, he admitted that he had heard it before too, but told me it was nothing to worry about. I hadn't been particularly scared at first, just confused, but something about his reaction put me even more on edge. If the camp was as remote as I thought, where had the sound come from? What really disturbed me was what happened next. The head counselor, a guy named Bill, abruptly canceled all future survival excursions the very next morning. The other junior counselors were disappointed, since these trips were one of the most exciting activities for both staff and campers. but they just sighed and moved on. I, on the other hand, became even more suspicious. If the bells weren't a big deal, then why shut down the trips entirely? When I politely asked Bill about it, he told me there had been multiple bear sightings in the past day, and that he didn't want to take any chances. It sounded like a completely reasonable explanation. We were up in northern Wyoming, after all, where both grizzlies and black bears were common, especially after a particularly wet spring. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me everything. The way he had reacted to my question about the bells, the way he suddenly decided to cancel the trips, it didn't sit right with me. To make things even stranger, we never saw any actual signs of bears in the area. No tracks, no claw marks on trees, no bear scat, nothing. And if the bears were such a big concern, why hadn't there been an official warning sent to the rest of the camp? Unfortunately, I never got any real answers. I was too busy with my other responsibilities to play detective, and to be honest, I had known Bill for years and liked him. I wasn't about to risk our friendship by pushing the issue too hard. Even if I had wanted to investigate, running around the woods alone in the middle of Wyoming, especially in the spring, was a terrible idea. So that was that. I never returned to work at the camp again, and nothing ever happened to any of the campers. No one went missing. No strange figures appeared in the woods. Nothing. But to this day, I still don't know what was behind those bells or why Bill reacted the way he did. It remains one of the creepiest stories I have to tell, especially because, even after all these years, I still have no explanation for what happened that night. I've spent most of my life in the Appalachians, always living in pretty remote spots, peaceful, quiet, and surrounded by forest. One night a few years back, I was sitting on my porch around 1 in the morning, sipping a beer and just enjoying the stillness. If you've never lived out here during the summer, let me tell you, nature doesn't quiet down at night. In fact, it gets incredibly loud. Cicadas buzz, frogs croak, and now and then you hear other animals making all sorts of noises. It's like nature's version of white noise. Sometimes it's relaxing. Other times, though, the woods throw something at you that makes your blood run cold. So, there I was, sitting on the porch, beer in hand, listening to that steady hum of the night. Then, out of nowhere, the sound just stopped. It was like a wave sweeping through the trees, and suddenly, you could hear a pin drop from 100 feet away. And right then, I heard the most horrifying sound of my life, coming from no more than 30 or 40 feet in front of me. It was an ear-splitting, bone-chilling scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard. I knew for sure it wasn't a cougar. I've heard them before, and they usually stay far from people. This was different. It had an eerie, almost human quality to it, but I knew deep down it wasn't a person, at least not any person in their right mind. I didn't waste time trying to figure it out. I got up, went inside, and sat by the front window with my shotgun within arm's reach, waiting until I was drunk enough not to care anymore. That was the first and only time I ever heard that sound, and I pray I never hear it again. Some folks have suggested it might have been a barn owl, since they can make some pretty creepy screeches, but there's no way that's what I heard. Owls are small, and whatever made that noise sounded way too big to be a bird. Plus, it wasn't a repeated call. It was one long, drawn-out shriek before I heard it moving deeper into the woods. Unless there's some unknown type of barn owl out here that moves on 4 legs, or even 2, I can say for certain it wasn't a bird. I don't live in that area anymore, and honestly, I'm relieved. Whatever was just 30 feet from me that night, I'd rather keep my distance.